I do not believe that there's some random way God puts us into the world and says, get on with it, and you need a bit of help, come and pray. We often forget that the God of calling is also the God of creation. And we misunderstand the fact that I have been created as a particular person. Before I was born in my mother's womb, he knew that I was going to be a banker. So that which God has created in me, he wishes to express in the calling that he has given me in a particular time frame. There was no sacred secular divide. There was no bishop or banker that was more preferable to God. My workstation is my worship station.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Guilbeault with Inspired. It's brilliant to be back for another fantastic week of encouragement. If you're new to us, I don't know about you, but I just had enough of listening to the news 24/7, and actually it's a strong discipline not to do that, because if you do that, if you get caught in that 24/7 news cycle, it just makes you depressed and anxious and fearful. And what we need is lashings of good news and encouragement, and that's what I know you're going to get this week, because we've got with us the legendary Ken Costa. Welcome, Ken.
Hi, Simon.
Fantastic to have you. So Ken and I, we go back, through HTB's Focus Weeks and New Wine, I'm guessing 25-ish years of attending those things and speaking at them. And there's so much to say about your CV, and that could take up half the interview. So basically, I just want to say, what should I say? You know, you've had a massive influence in the business world, also with the Alpha course, and chairman of that Alpha International. Fingers in loads of pies. God at Work was a very influential book that you wrote. You've been extremely successful in the business sector. But let's go right back. And I want to start back in South Africa, because that's where you were raised. For me, I spent my year out in South Africa when I was 18. It was a very tough time in what was called the Transvaal, working on a farm school. It was very tough, and it was actually a key stage of my life. But it was under apartheid. It was 1991-92. And you were a student at Wits University, and I think you're a student union leader. And you're accused of being a Marxist, is that right? And this is apartheid and the battles. So speak into your background and what was going on then.
Well, Simon, I'm so pleased we can share at least some of the red dust of the Transvaal, now the Limpopo province, with you, and thank you so much to you and to all those that are listening to this story time. And it starts really, in a sense, there. I was a young student in South Africa. I read law and philosophy at the university, became president of the Students' Union, and had this deep sense of the injustice of the apartheid regime. And that really gripped me in every way. I couldn't bear the thought of our racially separated schools, our racially separated university, as it was, and a fascist government that was determined to sort of undermine any form of student opposition. But I still believed that was the right thing. And I then believed, actually, Marx, in the proper understanding of Marx, which is Marx's concept of man, Erich Fromm and all those great writers of their time, which will be total history to most of the people listening to you, that it was the only way to end this terrible blight on humanity. And that was the basis of which we sort of carried on, trying to do as best we could at the time to be protesting against the iniquities of the apartheid system. So that was the background. And then all my friends were locked up, because they all thought to be communists, and my parents said, look, that makes no sense for you to be here. And I was packaged off and sent to university in England.
Were you in danger yourself, do you reckon?
Well, I wasn't so much in danger as I was watched. And you know that definition of democracy, which is that when the knock on the door comes in the morning, it's the milkman. Not that we have them anymore. But when it's a policeman, that's terrifying when you're a young student. And, we were watched carefully all the time. Every movement was watched. I remember, sort of being followed all the way to providing some food and sustenance and a bit of money to Winnie Mandela in one of the suburbs. And it was awful because, we were followed in, followed out. And everybody was watching you, and it's that terrible sense of being being watched all the time. Whereas at the same time, you're burning with the injustice of what's being done to somebody else, but not to you because you're a white person in a privileged condition. So you live in that compromised world, perhaps too compromised. But yeah, that's the early days. Don't like talking about it too much.
No, I can imagine. Well, I'm glad you didn't sit around. You know, it was that Edmund Burke, wasn't it? All that it takes for evil to prosper is for good people to do nothing.
Yes.
And there are a lot of good people doing nothing or accepting the status quo.
And particularly, sadly, the churches.
Yeah.
I mean, so then there was a poison as to what this Christian message was all about, if this could be allowed, because the prevailing view of the government at the time was this was all sort of part of the Christian message of people being forced to live separately. Horrific.
Yeah. So you get shipped off to England, you go to Cambridge University, I think you get a master's in law, is that right?
Yeah, and also I studied theology for a year,
Okay.
which of course is dangerous. You know, you pretend to know all about theology if you've only done it for a year. But the reason that I did that is because Cambridge was transformative. Because one could wake up in the morning, not have to worry about who you were with and that whole horrid setup. But it was transformative because there, I'd been brought up in a sort of nominally Catholic family, and faith came alive there. I thought I'd stay on and study theology for a year to see whether that which had been captured by imagination and my thought and my life would sustain academic scrutiny. And I think it did. Since then, I've had many questions about the ethical implications of Christian life, but never really doubted the foundation documents and the foundation person of the life of Jesus, who died, who rose, and who sent his Spirit to be with us.
So Nicky Gumbel, Nicky Lee, I know a lot of people came to faith in that season. For you, was it observing them and their behavior, their countercultural living?
Well, it was partly that. It was partly that one of those remarkable evangelists, David McInnes, did a series of missions, as it was then still called, in the university. And then a realization that actually, although I was doing everything, enjoying life, enjoying Cambridge, enjoying the freedom of all of that, yet there was something that was entirely missing. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it because I had assumed that it was religious, was covered by some formal activities, but I didn't really have any kind of religious feelings. But it did occur, and one person spoke to me, told me about Jesus, told me what Jesus did, and why he was interested in me, which seemed to me to be strange. And then, as in my subsequent life, I mean, could any rather arrogantly be seen as a sort of negotiation, which of course I've spent the rest of my life doing, a negotiation with God, which it went on like, okay, God, if you're true, and I can see this works out, why don't we just form a little joint venture? You, me, we'll do quite well in the world around us. And the answer sort of came, not sure about that. I said, okay, partnership. We'll put it together and we'll be partners in this great venture of life. You be God and I'll be me. Not sure. And then I eventually realized that actually, and I remember sitting in my room in Queen's College and saying to him, okay, look, 50-50 isn't going to work. What about 51? You have 51 of my life percent. I have 49. We'll still do it together. And I thought that was a great deal. But he wasn't. And then I realized that it had to be all or nothing. And at that moment, an extraordinary peace came over me. I felt as if, like those building cranes that lift a great big weight off them. And I sort of felt that at that moment, a weight had been just lifted off. And I then went and asked my friend, well, what does all this mean? And he then came and prayed. And I didn't quite know how you pray, to whom and about what, and publicly, and what do you say? So it was all those baby steps. And now, of course, one realizes the arrogance of trying to negotiate with the creator of the whole world. But those two overwhelming senses of which I still found are the foundations of my life and faith, is that he loves me, sure, but more particularly, he knows me. Because it's easy to love that which you don't know, but to know and to love That's the genius combination of the faith. Anyway, those were great times. And life started in a very different way.
As you're talking, I'm thinking of one of my favorite quotes by C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory, which I'll try to get right from memory. He says, God can't bless us until he has us. And when we try to keep areas of our life that are our own, the areas of death, and in love, he claims all. There's no bargaining with him. And I think we're often tempted to bargain. And it's not 51%, 49, it's not 70-30. And a repeated refrain from these podcasts is people reaching that place of total surrender. And once you're all in, then you experience the joy, you experience the peace, you experience the anointing and empowering to live for him. And what I love about getting you on this podcast is that a lot of people that we've had on do have quite extreme journeys into, war zones or cross-cultural missions, stuff like that. But no, God took you with your serious levels of gifting into the banking sector. And yes, the banking sector, it's a murky business, isn't it? We need godly bankers. So you go to SG Warburg and Co. And then I think that merged, didn't it, with UBS, and you end up as chairman of Lazard, was it? So, I mean, a meteoric rise, but what was it like being a follower of Jesus in that context?
Well, in the first series, it sort of didn't make any difference. I mean,
okay,
because those days, we joined things because there were jobs aplenty, and it was quite nice and it was quite comfortable. And of course, we went to church and you did all sorts of things that you would expect religious types to be doing. And Sunday was great, and it had the full experiences of the Spirit of God. But then, of the formative verse of my life is, John 6:63. The Spirit gives life, and I then realized that if this is going to be true, it has to be in every aspect of one's life. You can't live, as I think I did in those early years, in sort of a very compartmentalized life. When you were sort of, religious at the weekend and allowed during the week. And I think when, the nature of the Spirit gives life is that it's comprehensive. It affected everything. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought about that other piece from, in Colossians chapter 1, when Paul talks about in Christ Jesus, all things hold together, which means that the God of the money market is also the God of mercy, that the God of prayer is also the God of profit. There's one indivisible God. And it's a realization that actually the sacred and the secular, for all that it appears in our religious activity, is a misconception that these are one. Then how on earth do you live together when the two worlds collide? I mean, what is it? And the answer is, of course, that, in Christ Jesus, all things hold together. Yeah. And so I saw the workplace as being a manifestation of where God was as active. And people always ask me the question, well, what about work-life balance? Well, the moment you ask that question, you have created the very dichotomy that you have to avoid. Because the assumption is there's something called work and there's something called life. And the genius in the middle is me trying to balance work and life. Well, it doesn't work because they are in Christ Jesus. All these things hold together. And until one discovers that, and until I had discovered that my workplace was my worship station, my workstation, my worship station. That's where God called me to be. Now, it's uncomfortable because, all my other friends seem to be having sort of rather cushy jobs, teaching or big vicars or whatever it was. And I had to be stuck in the sort of cutthroat, the harsh commercial compromises that you have to commit every day. I mean, it's not, I made competitive on Monday and merciful on Tuesday. The thing runs together. That was quite a revelation. And then, of course, Nicky Gumbel kicked me and said, well, you've got to write it all down. I said, write what down? He said, well, what does God mean to you at work? And so God at work came about, partly to resolve for me, was God, if God was a supreme economist, as I believe God to be, then would it really be sensible to create somebody for an experience for an hour a week or 3 hours if you're a Pentecostal on a Sunday, or whether you would want to have him, infuse every day of your life.
Yeah.
And that was the revelation that actually, but it was progressive. Most people would have thought, well, Spirit of God is there to make you more religious. No, no, no. The Spirit of God is there to make us more human, because that's what Jesus came to do. But we had to learn afresh, this newness, this freshness. In God's mercy, I married my wife, Fiona, who's been amazing. We've been married for 42 years. And she was a missionary. I mean, she prayed to God and believed for food and for money sitting in South America. And I was in the middle of the money markets of the world. Completely different views and you have to fuse these things together. And that was a very formative part.
We don't have to go chronologically, so we're jumping around a bit here. But so you mentioned God at Work, your book, and that's kind of one of your main life messages. So go on, take 5 minutes of sort of crystallizing that for us to understand, because most people who are listening to this will be in the workplace. So go on, encourage us.
Sure. Look, the fact of the matter is, there is a very deep sense of calling. And one of the other books, Know Your Why, that I read deals with the issue of calling. And I believe we are called to the places that God wants us to be, specifically tailored for the person that he has made us to be. I do not believe that there's some random way God puts us into the world and says, get on with it, if you need a bit of help, come and pray. He has, before all ages, he knows our future. Before I was born in my mother's womb, he knew that I was going to be a banker. So there is a sense of a vested interest by God in me as a person in this time and this place for this purpose.
Yeah.
Now, when that happens, most people immediately think, well, it can only be in some form of religious experience. When I'm praying together, when we're in our smaller groups, when we're reading the Bible or whatever, all of which are fantastic and impossible to do without. But one has to take into account that it is in the workplace. My workstation is my worship station. So if I'm a lawyer and I draft a document that accurately reflects the party's views, that is a sign of hope in the world. That's a sign of God's work. If I'm an advertising executive, well, I'm not writing a legal document, but what I am doing is I am writing something to sell to somebody else with a natural and hard balance between that which is untrue and that which is grayish, as all selling documents need to be. And the more one struggles with that, the more one realizes that is God at work in the workplace regularly. But what I did discover at the time was that we often forget that the God of calling is also the God of creation. And we misunderstand the fact that I have been created as a particular person. I would be completely useless as a doctor because my creative gifts are not that. But what they are is related to the calling. And I found that in speaking to many people and trying to reconcile it in my own life, that one must see calling and creation going together. And actually to be able to be reinforced in the knowledge that which God has created in me, he wishes to express in the calling that he has given me in a particular time frame. So that became the sort of basis of God at Work, that there was no sacred secular divide. There was no bishop or banker that was more preferable to God. And it was a tough gig in the world that you have to live in. It's not easy. And so therefore you have to put in place a series of disciplines to enable one to thrive in that space. So far, so good.
Yeah. That's so good. Mark Green's been on the podcast before, and I think it is his book, Thank God It's Monday. He said, he talks about this, and clearly it's not true. He says, in the church, we've got this thing that all Christians are born equal, but inverted commas, full-time Christians are born more equal than others. And in turn, there's an unspoken hierarchy that goes something like this. Pastor at the top, then a bit lower down, overseas missionary, full-time Christian worker, moving down, tent maker, so long as it's abroad, elder, deacon, poor Christian, Christian, at the bottom, rich Christian. And that's you. So you're at the bottom of that skewed hierarchy that we absolutely reject, because as your life has demonstrated and your massive influence through Alpha and different sort of streams of influence, you just take it on the chin, don't you? Luke 12:48, Jesus said, to those who've been given much, much will be required. And there's an accounting for the talents we've been given. And I love how he's used you. Yeah, so talk about your passions and how he's used you.
Well, just to cover in the way in which, he's clearly used me in finance and in the city. It's very difficult. I don't know much about many things, but the one thing I do know about is the real power of money over people and their lives, over their judgments. And if you live with it every day, you after a while get, it's very hard. The commercial world is a hard place to be. Each day to live with that uncertainty in the workplace, but the certainty that God is with us. I'll give you an example. One day I was reading Psalm 112, which said that the person who trusts in God will fear no bad news. And I was thinking about it on the underground coming in. When I got into work that day, I was called in by the chairman, and he said, look, Ken, this is a difficult conversation, but the client who I was most close to has asked for you to be changed off the account. Which was a terrible blow to a young banker. And I thought I was doing quite well. And I, felt really crestfallen. But when I went back to my desk, a little whisper came and said, do you remember Psalm 112? If you trust in God, you will not fear bad news. Utterly transformed that moment. From being, depressing and ghastly to being part of life. There are ups and downs in life. Not everything that's down is the work of the devil. Life carries on like that. And repeatedly, I think, personally, I found the question of whether I should stay where I am or whether I should do something different. I even went and asked a bishop whether I should be ordained, and he said he would be very happy to ordain me. He was a great bishop from South Africa. Most of my friends thought it would be an utter disaster, the idea of me. But I went off and prayed, and there were two amazing incidents. I remember walking along the Thames and praying, and a verse of scripture just leapt out of me. Like sometimes, I can only describe like a dolphin that comes straight out, and you see this breaching whale or dolphin coming straight out and arrests you. And it was this, right at the end of Luke's Gospel in Luke 24, where it says, but stay in the city until you're filled with power from on high. Now, of course, all your theologians and hermeneutical scholars will scream and say, well, this is typical misuse of the Bible. Actually, it's not, because those three words, stay in the city, actually confirmed to me then that I should stay in the city of London, where I was working. Which was an enormous comfort. But here's the strange thing. Several years later, because these things always come in cycles, when you're overburdened by doing something, you've been doing it for a long time, you're itchy, you want to do something else. Fee and I went off to Rome, and we were outside the Vatican. And in one of those, sitting on one of those, in between the pillars, was a monk dressed in a Franciscan habit with, just ordinary monk, you would have thought. But I had this instinct that I should give him some money. So I said to Fee, look, I'd like to give that person some money. And she thought, well, okay. So off I went to see this guy, and he spoke no English. But he was sitting there with his Bible open. But there was a friend of his there, and who spoke English, and said this was a Slovenian hermit who had walked from Slovenia 500 miles,
Wow.
and entirely as based on people never asking, but people giving him food and giving him money. So tears came in his eyes as I gave him the money. And I looked at his Bible and I said to him, well, he didn't understand. I asked him to say, well, what are you reading? And he pointed to Luke 24:49. But stay in the city
Wow.
until you're filled with the Spirit on high. And I mean,
Love that.
at that moment, you kind of said,
Goosebumps.
tough gig, but it's God.
Yes. Love that. So, listen, Ken, you've obviously had a lot of successes in life, but every successful person has had failures. How can you speak into failure?
Well, failure is painful, but you won't, you cannot flourish unless you know the pain of failure, because it's in the furnace of failure that faith flourishes. I don't believe, and I didn't really want to listen to anybody who hasn't had a series of failures in their lives, because you obviously haven't lived.
Yeah.
In my case, I left one of the place I was working, and together with some of the best people in the city, we set up a business to deal in the emerging markets, which we all knew about. And everybody said, listen, Ken, with you and with all the best from Goldman Sachs, you guys are going to do so well. Well, it was a failure. We got the timing wrong. It was immensely painful then, and it still is now. But I learned a few things, which I just pass on, really. The first is, don't linger. You can't, if you replay the vid, it's not going to change. It happened. So don't linger over it. Don't juice it for a pretty party. The pity doesn't overcome. Secondly, learn from what happened. And that's quite painful, because you have to face the fact that certain decisions that you made are not the right ones, even though you believed they were at the time, and even though you believed God was in it. Because his thoughts are not our thoughts, his ways are not our ways, his decisions are not our decisions, and the other way around. So I think that one has to look at that very carefully and be able to say, I want to learn from this, to go back over the experience, talk to the people involved, talk to the people outside who observed it. What did you observe? Don't linger, do learn, and then lean forward. Now, leaning forward is not just a nice self-help book. I mean, I know nothing about self-help or therapy, but I do know about the power of God. Leaning forward is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And so therefore, there is a future. There is a hope. There is something painful as the years may be to wipe over the losses. There is something to look forward to that is positive, credible, and practical. So those three things sort of formed the way I tried to deal with that and, well, many other failures.
Very helpful. So you involve some mega deals. We're talking about 1.5 billion, one transaction. I was reading about. How do you keep your feet on the ground? How do you hear God's voice in that? What does it look like?
Well, sometimes there are battles, particularly in the world that I'm doing, which are mergers, acquisitions, hostile activity. My basic theory of all of this is that if you try and do this on your own, you're in trouble. Because one does need a measure of discernment, which is a spiritual gift. And discernment is not simply something that happens only in churches when you're having to pray with somebody. And discernment is a day-to-day activity of what is the right thing to do in the right set of circumstances. But I do remember in one very, very contentious and quite high-profile transaction, when the parties were at each other in a very, very, really awful way. And I put the whole deal together and therefore wanted to be sure that it would succeed.
Mm-hmm.
And in one very, very tense moment, I remember picking up the telephone and to phone, knowing that this was a battle. And, I was praying as I do in times when things are difficult. And as I picked it up, the tune that came in on the waiting for the call was Chariots of Fire. And at that moment, I realized that unseen, there were chariots of fire around what was happening. And so I prayed for a resolution of that which couldn't be seen in that moment. And amazingly, and it is amazing, and obviously the details will be private to me, I knew in that instant that it was done. And we had many ups and downs after that. But in that instant, I knew that we would get through this. Now, this doesn't always happen.
Yes. You talked earlier about worlds colliding or value systems colliding, and can you share any sort of time where your integrity has been really stretched and it's been either costly or you've seen God's hand through you treading the righteous path?
Yeah, most days. I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's an arrogance to believe that you could exist in this world, do not love the world or anything in it. You've got to start each day in the belief that God will intervene. Sometimes we understand why, sometimes we don't, and sometimes the decisions are difficult. There are many occasions. I similarly had a call from a very good Christian friend of mine, and the company that he was involved in was actually going to go south. It was a big bank, and they were looking to have investors come into the bank. And he said to me, "You're advising this person?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, will you advise them to put the money into the bank, and it would help save the bank?" So I said, "No." So he said to me, "Well, why not?" I said, "Well, because my judgment is that this is not the right thing to do." So he said, "Well, look, would you go and pray about it and then come back to me?" So I said, "No." So he said, well, he got angry and said, "You're a Christian and we should be praying about these things, and why are you not going to pray about it?" And I said, "Well, because God has given me a set of judgments. He's given me a heart, a mind, a brain, analytical capacity, and in my professional judgment, this is not the right thing to do." And he was absolutely furious. And you can imagine, sort of, and the bank went down. So sometimes, I mean, it's, I wish I could say you get it right, but it's very difficult. As every person realizing this, we're living in a constant tension between the already and the not yet. Being in, people say, I often say the basis of our moral judgments every day of discernment is say, well, you're in the world, but not of the world. No. We are within the world, not just in it. We are within it. We share the pathology of the world around us, but it doesn't affect us. That's the genius of the work of the Spirit of God, is that we can still be within the system and yet be able to have a different moral coding that can make us see different judgments that are, for better or for worse, the good part of life.
Yeah, profound.
But so that's the business world. I mean, that's the finance world, and some of the other part of life has been always very fulfilling as well, of being able to to have these life verses that can guide you through. I mean, I would always encourage whoever it is, have a verse that you can go to in good times and in the bad times. We always say, well, you have something when something's going terribly wrong. And there's a certain evangelical pessimism that hits people. And then, I always get people saying, well, I've been in the workplace and it's, really tough. The devil has really got hold of me. Well, the devil hasn't got hold of you. It's called life. It's called risk. It's called, But what has happened? And then I always ask the question, in the good days when you got to bed at night, did you really say, God, thank you so much for the day that I've had? So you've got something to compare. That's not just a one-way street of some horrible, horrible experiences. So outside of the workplace, it's been an amazing being able to minister to, gather together young Christians, older Christians, speak into their lives, see changes that occur. If it's purely that of the business world, and then I think one does suffer. You do need something outside of that to just to keep the basic balance in a very, very difficult world we're living in.
Yeah, yeah. As you're talking about life verses, one of them for me that came to mind was 1 Thessalonians 5:24. The one who calls you is faithful.
Yeah.
And he will do it. And I stand on that along with a whole bunch of others. But you're talking about one of your key engagements, which is investing in the next generation. Before we started the live interview, we were talking about precious, now in glory, Caleb Meekins, who's one of those young, precious, dynamic, turbocharged followers of Jesus. And it's, for us, it's so sad that he graduated to glory. He died through a horrible car crash in Ethiopia. But he was one, and many others that you had a relationship with, and now you've got plenty of people. Talk about the mentoring aspect of your work and the fruitfulness there.
Well, let me just share the motivating verse as to why I am and have been, really interested in that next generation. And in Psalm 71, it says, even when I'm old and grey, do not forsake me, my God, till I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who are to come. Well, I'm certainly grey, but I do not accept that I'm old. But I'm afraid the actual clock, as opposed to my perception of the clock, declares me to be old. So I'm old and grey, but I want to declare the power of God to that next generation.
Yes.
I want to be able to tell them, how we started. Well, Nicky Gumbel started, one of the greatest evangelists of our generation, started Alpha as a work of God. I had the privilege of chairing it for 16 years, but it was his starting, and but that was, of course, a proclaiming to the next generation at a time when it wasn't, a quiet revival, which is what we're mercifully seeing at the moment. I don't think it's that quiet either. And so I've always taken into my mind that the way to do that is to ensure that the groupings of people come together so they can share the stories. We overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the testimony of the saints. And the testimonies of the saints are not necessarily just some sort of deliverance in a church service or whatever. It's testimonies of living every day in a hostile world. How do I get through the day? How do I not get ratty with the person sitting next to me, or furious with my colleagues, or forgive people who have harmed me? That is the bit I want to show. That is the power of God, the power of forgiveness, being the most difficult in the workplace. And I remember writing a letter to a colleague of mine who was a senior colleague who had offended me very deeply. And I wrote to him and said, look, I'm terribly sorry that this has happened, but I want you to know that I don't hold it against you. And he was amazed by getting this letter, particularly, I suppose, coming from me, because I was so cross with him. But it did change, an atmosphere changed. So what I want to do is to combine the great spiritual truths. I operate in the space between spirituality and spreadsheets. And so I gathered together, and have for 15, 20 years now, gathered together a grouping of young leaders across the denominations. Curiously, one of the only places where they do meet across the denominations. And then separately, because this is such a crying need, those in their 20s we're meeting in a month's time, of the 20-year-old young guys who are trying to work out, how do we fulfill God's call in our lives? So yes, I do that, and then that's a collective piece. But there is a God-given gift, which, I mean, it is a gift. I think it's just normal chatting, and others sort of categorize it as prophetic, which, I mean, I don't have a beard and I wish I had some hair. They don't fit the prophetic mold.
Me too.
Of being able at times to speak into people's lives. And to be able to speak into someone's life is an enormous privilege, because, it sort of says, what does God know about you that you don't know about you, but I can see? And to be able to draw out of them that which they wish they could admit to, or give them language to admit to, because everybody in the Christian world will say, oh, well, if you did that, you'll be filled with pride. Pride is not the besetting sin of this generation, I tell you that. Of course, it's generally true, it's a great sin for everybody, but it's not the besetting sin. But the lack of ambition is, where, people are not prepared to exert the gifts that God has given to them in order to achieve that which God has laid before them. And that's a huge privilege, to be able to speak into that, on the one hand, in terms of their gifting, and on the other hand, in terms of the spirituality. I'll give you an example. I was speaking to a group of visiting people from America on Jacob and the wrestling match in Jacob. And it came to me while I was speaking, literally the simple question, who started the fight? Who started the fight at the wrestling match? Well, it was God who started the fight. And when I was speaking to them, I was saying to them, you've all got struggles. You're fighting with yourself. You're fighting with God. You're fighting with other people. But you've forgotten that God started the fight. That what he wants to do is he wants space in your life. He wants to crystallize that which is inchoate. And that's why he uses others. Well, I mean, people broke down, they were in tears. It was a genuine moment of the Spirit, because it was a truth that was in season. And just, years after this, I still meet the same people who say, do you remember that time? It changed my life. Now, I mean, that's priceless stuff. And but
gold.
It's not every day. Every day is tough. It's waiting on God. It's not seeing things. It's pretty dull. And, you have to live through the dull, as well as the highlights.
And one of the things I love about, in broadest generalizations, African culture is that they and many other different non-individualistic cultures really value old people, because old people have accrued generational wisdom and experience, whereas in the West it's all about being young. And actually, for older listeners, I want you to know, you have got so much to bring. You're not invalidated. You're not past your prime. You basically got think of who you can invest in. Who I know you're doing it, Ken, but there's loads of 20-somethings saying, who will mentor me? Who will come alongside me and share that wisdom? We've lost elders, haven't we? One of mine, Trevor Waldock, talks about this eldership as a key concept. So God bless you for doing that.
Yeah, and I think it's so good that you make that reference, because as many of you know, I've written this book called The $100 Trillion Wealth Handover, when the boomers hand over to the zoomers, how this will change the market economy. And this is a massive going on, but there are very serious spiritual issues in this generational change. And to your point, wealth will transfer, and it's happening now. The Bank of Mum and Dad are helping to subsidize deposits and paying for universities and rent, etc. Even now. There's not something that's going to happen in 20 years' time. It's happening now. But wealth will transfer to, obviously, a particular part of society. But what about wisdom?
Yeah.
How will wisdom move to the generation? And that is what, I'm really, really keen on. And it's taken me some time, because I've had to realize that by sheer experience and all of that, I have wisdom. It's not infallible, not the Pope. But we need to accept that we have wisdom capable of being handed to a generation to see the power of God in their lives. And I think that's very important. But it has to come together with the daily spiritual disciplines that make for living in this world, because that's the essential root of my life.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. I'm working with the vicar of my church called Pete Winter on something called Awaken 50, which is a meditation each day on the work of the Spirit in our lives. And although I've seen many of these Bible reading pieces, very few of them contain the practical advice of the day-to-day experience of living in the world, appreciating beauty, accepting a wonderful lyric from a secular song, finding purpose in things that are not necessarily religious, sending a text of encouragement to someone, practical things that actually build the day to enable you to undertake the bigger things when they arrive.
Hey folks, I love being part of this massive international community of faith gathered around this podcast. And I think most of you know that it comes out under the auspices of Great Lakes Outreach, and we work in Burundi, which is currently tragically still the hungriest country in the world. And yet amidst the grim narrative, there's so much beautiful stuff going on. And we reckon that our 30 ministry partners out there have meaningfully impacted 950,000 people this year, and you can be a part of it. Could you consider giving, £20 or $10 a month, something that's small to us that makes a humongous impact out there as we get prostitutes out of prostitution by teaching them a trade, or microfinance initiatives for widows to be able to start their own business, or orphanages being equipped with what they need, school sponsorship. There's so much beautiful stuff. If you want to consider that, I would love your help. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do so. Go to greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. That's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. Thanks so much for your consideration. And now let's get back to the podcast.
Amen. Give us an example about sharing your faith in the workplace.
Let me give you two examples. One is sharing faith without words. Mm-hmm. We were working through a very complex battle between two major companies through the night, 3 nights running, pizzas at 2:00, cold pizzas, hot pizzas. And I saw the colleague next to me utterly distressed. And I said to him, Pete, come for a walk with me. And we walked across London Bridge, and we walked back over London Bridge. And I never said anything to him about anything. 20 years later, he still remembers that that's what I did, and believes it was because of the faith that I had. At the opposite end, a very senior business person came to me and said, would I have lunch with him? And I was very excited, the prospect of having lunch with him. But when we got to lunch, I thought there might be a nice deal to be done. And he said to me, you know about God? So I said, utterly, my jaw practically dropped. Most unlikely person to ask me this question. So I said, well, we've met, or something like that. And he said, look, there are boxes in my life. There is a box called friends. And I've been very successful, but in the success, I have neglected my friends that I made when I was in school, in university, in the Navy. And I've redressed that. I've gone back to them. We've had time together. I've neglected my family in order to get to where I've got to. And I got divorced. But I went back to my former wife and to the children and said, look, I didn't behave as I should have. Can you forgive me? I've done very well. I'm the chairman of 2 major companies in the UK. I made a lot of money. And then he said, but there is a box that's empty. And I know that if I fill that box, it will be the key to all the other things of my life. I don't know what to call it. Can you help? I think it might be spiritual. And so I had the opportunity of being able to talk to him about the spirituality, about another F. He sorted out his family, sorted out his finance, sorted out his friends. He needed to sort out faith. And, for an hour in one of the best restaurants in London, utterly disappointed as I started because I thought I was going to get a great deal out of it. I believe I got something even greater out of it. And sadly, he has died. And I believe that he would have died with some understanding, perhaps not as clearly as I would have liked it, of what it is to have faith in God.
Amen. You mentioned 16 years of being chairman of Alpha. Now, a lot of people will be familiar, but the tent is broad under which people are listening to this podcast. So can you give sort of highlights of the extraordinary impact that you've been privileged to be part of as God's woven the tapestry through that movement?
Well, the most extraordinary thing is its accessibility to ordinary people. And whether that's in a prison in Zambia, or whether it's in a university in Cambridge, or whether it is in the business part of the world, and whether it's in old or young, whether it's in this culture or that culture, it is extraordinary, universal. And in that fact, it establishes the universality of the basic good news of Jesus Christ. And that, of course, there are masses of miracles and there are many people who've come to faith through Alpha. I'll give you an example from yesterday. A young banker working for me asked me, please, to come and see him. So I go and see him in a very nice office in a fashionable square in the city of London. And he says to me, I don't want to talk to you about the banking bit, but I've had an experience I cannot explain. I know there is something beyond the material world. I sensed it in my room. I know that it's God. But Ken, you know about God. Is it God? What is it? I said, well, what did you do? He said, well, I went to my local church, which was not the sort of church I would have recommended him to go, but it's a church, and I sensed the same thing in that church that I had sensed in my room. So he said, what do I do? So I said to him, well, the first thing to do is to recognize that which you had experienced, which I discerned was, of course, God, is embodied in the person of Jesus. And you need to get to know Jesus, who he is. Have you read the Bible? No. Well, start by reading Mark's Gospel, because it's the shortest in a modern translation. And you and your wife don't separate the two of you, because she wasn't anywhere there. Get on to Alpha and understand how this all fits together. And increasingly, I think we're seeing people having experiences that, without the, they don't have the agency of other people involved. This is him alone. And the more we're hearing and seeing this happening, the more I think that Alpha comes into its own as being precisely ordinary, precisely accessible. It's food, it's discussion, it's people, it's meeting. So yeah, one of the great privileges of being able to play a small part in it.
Yeah, and actually quite a big part, which is great. But even in the last 2 weeks, a friend of mine has come to faith through Alpha and been baptized, and it's such a joy to see that. And we cheer on Alpha, we cheer on Christianity Explored, we cheer on any sort of means by which people are introduced to to Jesus, the living Jesus. Ken, we're running out of time. There's so much we haven't covered, but I want to give you the floor just now to blast us with some Costa parting wisdom. Go for it.
I come down to the very basics of what I'd want to leave you with, and that is that I'm loved by God and I'm known by him. It's an unbelievable combination. And we need we need to have a solid foundation. Why? Because we're living in a VUCA world, a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, anxious and angry. And you cannot live in this world with mental health issues huge in the generation, with people living in their rooms and never getting out of their rooms. We need to rediscover what it is to be humans. How can I be a human person in a hostile world that is VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, angry, anxious? And you come back to saying that Jesus is that foundation, that the Spirit of the living God, and I have spent most of my life believing and working on the Spirit of the living God. The Spirit gives life. If ever I have to make a difficult decision, I ask myself, does this decision give me life? Do I say, oh, I'm so excited, I want to go on with it? Or is there, well, maybe not? If it doesn't give life, don't go there. But the Spirit gives life because I am known and I'm loved by Jesus, who died for me and who gave the Spirit of God to be active in my life. And therefore there is a daily battle that goes on. Voices bring choices. Which voice are you going to listen to? Which choice will you make? It is an essential. And so I'd say, in absolute conclusion, which is that trusting of God, trusting of Jesus every day, requires one very simple act: unfollow yourself. Because whenever we put ourselves in to try and help God, to try and find our own way, trying to do more than we were called to do, we interfere in the way in which God wants to work. He wants to work through us, but not by seeing us. We put ourselves in the center, and therefore we follow our instincts, our hopes, our desires, our expectations, our skills, our callings. Unfollow yourself and follow him.
Just want to sit in that. Wow. Ken, you've shared a lot of gold with us. Some of it needs re-listening to, but I just want to cheer you on.
Thank you.
As you're young at heart, you're old and grey, but no, you're young at heart, and there's lots more life in the tank yet. So God bless you as you continue serving him. Oh, thanks so much for your time. I want to thank you. I also want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing, Mike Sandeman for the mixing. And guys, if you enjoyed it, share this with other people. I actually, just something that came to me when you're talking earlier, which I want everyone to have that sense of calling. One of my favourite books is by you probably know Os Guinness personally.
Yes. Oh,
wonderful man. Well, I want everyone to have that sense of calling, because whether you are full-time mothering right now, or whether you are an electrician or a teacher or a health practitioner, whether we're in the arts, media, business, education, and whatever, seeing. Well, let me just finish with this quote by Oz. It's in his book, The Call. He says, "Calling is the truth that God calls us to himself so decisively that everything we are, everything we do, everything we have is invested with a special devotion and dynamism lived out as a response to his summons and service."
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
And folks, you're listening right now, you are called. He loves you. He wants to use you. And we've had some great fodder for thought this week. So yeah, spread this to other people. Next week, very different story. That's the nature, the beauty, the diversity of the body of the Christ. But in the meantime, have a good week. God bless you, and toodaloo.